Hi everybody, my name is Donald Robertson and I'm going to be speaking to you about Stoic philosophy and the Stoic guide to surviving a pandemic, and in particular we're going to be talking about the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, who's the most famous Stoic of antiquity. So if you're interested in Stoicism, say hello in the comments, and of Marcus Aurelius, just make a quick comment. I always like to see people responding. Just let me know if you've read the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. So this is the agenda. I think it's always helpful to say at the beginning what we're planning to cover. So I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction and explain a little bit more about who I am. And then I'm going to talk about who the Stoics were, and in particular who Marcus Aurelius was. And then we'll talk about what the Stoics believe. So we're going to be talking about philosophy and psychology, but I'm going to keep it pretty short and sweet, because what I really want to get to is number 4 on the agenda there, which is the major Stoic techniques. So the techniques, practical psychological techniques that could help you cope with a situation like the pandemic, or really just help you be more resilient and cope better with stress generally in life. And then I've got a bunch of optional content at the end. I've got some extra bonus Stoic techniques. So if we have time, we'll get into those. Otherwise, we'll have a bit of extra time for Q&A. We'll play it by ear and see how it goes, basically. So a bit of an intro about me, who the Stoics were, what they believed, and then we'll get into the practical techniques. How does that sound? So without further ado, I'll say a little bit about myself. Who am I? And also, I'm part of an organization called Modern Stoicism. I'll say a little bit about that, just because it's one of the main resources if you're interested in learning more about this subject. So I'm not going to say a lot. I don't know. I guess we can make these slides available afterwards if there's information that people want to get to, book titles and stuff like that. My name is Donald Robertson. My website is donaldrobertson.name. I'm a cognitive behavioral psychotherapist. I've written a bunch of books about Stoicism and psychotherapy. I come from Scotland, as you might guess, but trickily, confusingly, I'm actually Canadian now. I turned into a Canadian a few years ago, and I'm in Halifax in Nova Scotia at the moment. It's a rainy day here. And my background's in academic philosophy originally, and my specialism is really the intersection between ancient philosophy and modern evidence-based psychotherapy, so particularly Stoic philosophy and modern cognitive behavioral psychotherapy. And I began being involved with Stoicism quite a long time ago now, back in about 1996 it was, and I published one of my first articles, in case you're wondering. And here's a bunch of books that I wrote. Right, that's a quick plug. I'm not going to dwell on that, but there they are. And different translations of my most recent book, which is called How to Think Like a Roman Emperor. And it's been translated into about 9 different languages so far. So that's who I am. Just as an aside, I'm actually working on a graphic novel at the moment. A little bit of trivia for you. So maybe if you look online, you'll see some images from that about the life and philosophy of Marcus Aurelius again. So I mentioned Modern Stoicism because it's really the best resource for finding out more about Stoicism. It's a non-profit organization. It's run by a multidisciplinary team of volunteers, psychologists, philosophers, classicists, and it's founded in 2012 by Professor Christopher Gill, Professor Emeritus of Ancient Thought from Exeter University. And it does a bunch of things. We run Stoic Week every year. We have a big course, which is about to begin actually running again. So you can enroll if you're interested. It's called Stoic Mindfulness and Resilience Training, a 4-week course. It's free. And we use that to gather data on the benefits, the efficacy of Stoic psychological techniques. And we run an annual conference called Stoicon, which is probably going to be a virtual conference this year, and lots of little conferences called Stoicon X. And we have a big blog with about 600 plus articles on it about Stoicism. So I mention all that stuff because if you're interested, that's a load of free resources. And it's kind of a bit more authoritative because it's been put together by a multidisciplinary team of experts. So let's get into the guts of what Stoicism actually is and how it might be of benefit and relevance to you. So who were the Stoics? Well, Stoicism was founded in 301 BC by a guy called Zeno of Citium, and he was a foreigner at Athens. He was shipwrecked there, and he was actually a wealthy merchant. He traded in this purple dye called Tyrian dye. So he was a wealthy man, but he lost his fortune at sea, and he studied all the schools of philosophy in Athens and eventually founded his own school in the Athenian Agora, the marketplace, out in public. So Stoicism was kind of a philosophy of the street, and he called it the Stoic school after the Stoa Poikile, or painted porch building, but it was sort of an art gallery actually. And you can visit the ruins of it today. But you may be more familiar with the three most famous Stoics. The Stoic school flourished for about 500 years in antiquity. And what I want to get to is the Stoics that you might have heard of. So you may have heard of Seneca. He was a rhetoric teacher, an advisor to the Emperor Nero, and he's one of the finest writers of antiquity. Epictetus, who is one of the most famous teachers of philosophy in the history of Rome, and Marcus Aurelius, who we're mainly going to be talking about today, who is antiquity and a Roman emperor. And you might know Marcus Aurelius from the movie Gladiator with Russell Crowe, where he was played by Richard Harris. So those are the Stoics you're most likely to have heard of, but they all come from the Roman imperial period, so they're Johnny-come-latelys, as it were, and we only really have fragments from the writings of the early Greek Stoics, the founders of the school. So it lasted a long time. It lasted 5 centuries. Compare that to Freudian psychoanalysis or Marxism, for example, these kind of cultural movements or philosophies that, you know, maybe flourished for like 100 years or so, and then things kind of move on. Stoicism become popular again today. It's going through a resurgence in popularity. So I said we were mainly going to talk about Marcus Aurelius. Let me check in. How many of you have read the Meditations then? Oh, you've got a kind of glitchy stream. Okay, I'm sorry about that. Just keep me updated on that and let me know if you're still having problems. Yep. A few of you are saying that you've read the Meditations. That's good. Okay, so the Meditations are Marcus Aurelius's notes to himself, as someone mentioned, I think. The textual evidence suggests it was never meant for publication. There are clues in the text that suggest it wasn't intended to be published. And I've never really seen anyone else put it like this before, but, you know, I've been doing a lot of talks about the pandemic. People keep asking me about it. And the irony is, Marcus Aurelius wrote the Meditations in the middle of a pandemic. And at a stretch, you could view the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. It was originally called To Himself, because it consists of Stoic psychological and moral advice that he gives to himself, lots of aphorisms. A Stoic manual for coping psychologically with a pandemic that he was facing, which I'll say a little bit about. It's called the Antonine Plague, and it happened starting around about 165 AD, kind of near the beginning of Marcus Aurelius' reign as emperor. It's named after Marcus Aurelius, so his cognomen, the name of his dynasty, is the Antonines. So his full name is Marcus Aurelius Antoninus. We call it the Antonine Plague after him, therefore. It's also called Galen's Plague after his physician, who's a famous author of antiquity called Galen. And Galen left us some writings describing the symptoms of the plague. We don't really know for sure, but it's believed that it may have been a form of smallpox. It started off in Parthia. It may have even spread to China. It spread throughout the Roman Empire really quickly because Marcus was fighting the Parthian War. It just ended, and as the Roman legionaries and the people who accompanied them, including merchants and so on, all traveled back throughout the empire to where they originally came from, their garrisons. They took the virus with them and spread it all, happening today. But the Antonine Plague was much more severe than the pandemic that we're facing at the moment. It was estimated to have killed up to 5 million people in the Roman Empire alone. And the outbreaks, there were multiple outbreaks, as there often are with these things, that went on for at least 15 years. And also, began to struggle economically, and is really in the middle of the initial outbreaks. Rome's enemies along the northern frontier, having fought a war in the east, Marcus now had to fight a war in the north of the empire because they took it as an opportunity for a massive invasion of the Roman Empire. So that what the Romans called the barbarian, the northern tribes, saw this as an opportunity because the legions were devastated by this illness. And so being vulnerable, Rome was invaded. bad news there. Some actually believe, what is Stoicism? Just check in. Yeah, you guys seem to be okay now. Cool. Let me know if the stream's okay, or if anybody's still having problems with it. Okay, so the first thing really is the definition of Stoicism. And, you know, it's a simple point to make, but there's a distinction between Stoicism, written usually with a lowercase s, and capitalized Stoicism. So when people talk about Stoicism, they sometimes mean the modern concept of a coping style or a personality trait that's unemotional, the endurance of pain or hardship without a display of feelings and without complaint. And that's only very loosely or tenuously connected to Stoicism, capitalized, the ancient Greek school of philosophy, which has a much more nuanced and much more complex worldview. It has a whole worldview and a more nuanced theory of emotion, I should say. And the reason it's really important for me to say that is, if you look online, there's a lot of misinformation about Stoicism. You know, the internet, welcome to the internet, and it's full of people confusing Stoic philosophy with Stoicism, the coping style. And journalists write this, where they've just mixed up these two words, basically. It's shocking, really, but a lot of misinformation because people don't understand the difference between these two concepts. And actually, there's research, they're important to distinguish, because there's a reasonably large body of modern scientific research that shows that Stoicism, the coping style, is actually quite toxic and unhealthy, whereas Stoicism, the philosophy, as we'll see, is the philosophical inspiration for our leading evidence-based form of psychotherapy. So one of them is really bad for your mental health, and one of them is really good for your mental health. So it would be very important not to get them. Just give people a chance to respond. Say hello if you can see me now. I'm sorry about that. I think you just lost me for a minute. Just comment and confirm that we're all back. So you guys all understand the difference between Stoic philosophy and Stoicism, the modern idea of a kind of stiff upper lip, unemotional coping style. So Stoicism, the coping style, bad for your mental health. It's quite toxic and unhealthy. Stoicism, the Greek philosophy, is the philosophical basis for the leading evidence-based form of psychotherapy. So it's good for your mental health. Got it. Cool. Okay, let's continue then. And one other big reason that these are different is that when people talk about Stoicism today, they often leave out the social dimension of it. So the Stoics, particularly Marcus Aurelius, were concerned with what you could call social virtue, the dikaiosune, or justice, the virtue. Almost on every page of the Meditations, Marcus is emphatic about this idea that Stoicism is love. It's a philosophy of social virtue. It's a philosophy about the brotherhood of man, or brotherly love. It is the philosophical precursor in many ways of early Christian ethics. So Seneca writes, "No school has more goodness and gentleness, none has more love for human beings, nor more attention to the common good than Stoicism." So that might come as a surprise if people think Stoicism is just about having a stiff upper lip. Like, it's also, you know, one of the main inspirations for the Christian idea of the brotherhood of man. Pierre Hadot, one of the leading scholars in this area, said, "It cannot then be said that loving one's neighbour as oneself is a specifically Christian invention. Rather, it could be maintained that the motivation of Stoic love is the same as that of Christian enemies, lacking in Stoicism." In fact, Marcus Aurelius talks about it. So I'm not going to dwell on that aspect today, but I just want to throw it in there to highlight this idea that the internet's awash with people that think Stoicism is just about being tough. So they'll say, you know, is Conor McGregor a Stoic or something like that? Well, you know, that maybe some of these individuals are kind of tough or resilient or whatever, but Stoic philosophy is something much more complex than that and more rounded, and has this social dimension to it. And that's quite prominent, actually, in the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, because he's a Roman emperor and he's very concerned with justice in society. So what's the real central doctrine of Stoicism? It's this idea about the goal of life. Very simply, in ancient Greece and Rome, different schools of philosophy were often distinguished from one another in terms of their definition of the fundamental goal of life. So you could say, as we say today, the meaning of life is understood differently according to these different schools. So the Epicurean school, for example, thought that the goal of life was hedone, or pleasure, or ataraxia, kind of peace of mind. And that's different from what the Stoics say. The Stoics say that fundamentally, although these different schools might have superficial similarities, many of them, in fact, like they're moving in a different direction. They've got their eye focused on a different end result. With the Stoics, the goal of life is wisdom, or as they call it, arete, which we usually translate as virtue, but that's not really a very good translation. I think a better translation would be moral wisdom. So arete means virtue or moral wisdom. And the Stoics also describe that in a kind of slightly contrived way. They call it living in agreement with nature. And the connection between those things is that the Stoics believe that human nature is inherently thinking, reasoning, and language using. And they think we have an obligation to ourselves. Because we're always thinking about life, we have an obligation to think logically and rationally and to use this gift of language and reason to the best of our ability. And if we were doing that, we would become rational and wise beings. We would live rationally and wisely. And if we did live rationally and wisely in terms of our relationship with individuals and society, then we would also be exercising the virtue of justice, of the kaiosune as well. So the Stoics have this idea of the different virtues, but they're all connected to this principle of following reason or living rationally, as they put it. Cool. So here's a little bit of kind of hardcore philosophy, as it were. The Stoics are heavily influenced by Socrates, right? So I'm not going to be doing a lot of philosophy today in terms of looking at arguments and so on. I'm more going to be focusing on practical techniques, but we do need to look at what the essence of Stoicism is, what the Stoics really believed. And their central belief comes from Socrates. They argue, once I kind of put it glibly by saying that with the Stoics, we kind of have a bullet point version of Socrates. With Socrates, we get these arguments that go all around the houses, and with the Stoics, we just kind of get a list of the conclusions and how to put them into practice. So if you're interested, there's a Socratic dialogue written by Plato. Plato's not our only source for Socrates, by the way. We also have many dialogues written by one of his other students called Xenophon. And actually, the Stoics were more interested in Xenophon's version of what Socrates taught. But one of the best Platonic dialogues for understanding this kind of, like, it's called the Euthydemus. Incidentally, just as an aside to this aside, during the pandemic, if you've got time on your hands, one of the Socratic texts that the Stoics quote most often is the Apology that was written by Plato. And it's a short text, and it's a literary masterpiece. It's arguably the most important philosophical text in the Western canon. And it's one of the texts that the Stoics like to quote as well. So it's not the one I'm going to be talking about right now, but you know, if you want to read something about Socrates, read Plato's Apology, because I have no hesitation in recommending it. It's relatively short, and it's a beautiful philosophical masterpiece. So there's a bit of a hard sell for going out and reading the Apology. I'll be shameless about plugging that. It would be like plugging Shakespeare's Hamlet or something. Everyone should read Plato's Apology. So this is, there are Stoic ideas in the Apology, but in the Euthydemus, we get this much more developed argument. And basically, in the Euthydemus, Socrates argues that everything except wisdom and moral virtue is indifferent with regard to the goal of life. So he asks his interlocutor, he asks Euthydemus, what good fortune consists in. Socrates always starts off by asking people to define something that seems kind of trite and common sense and banal. So any Athenian would say, well, good fortune consists in having lots of money, having loads of friends, having a status in society, being good looking and fit and healthy and all that kind of stuff. That's what good fortune consists in life. And Socrates then proceeds to dismantle this. And he starts with wealth, if I remember rightly, as an example. And he says, well, by a good person. But what happens if you put loads of money in the hands of a political tyrant or somebody who's a complete idiot? Then, like people say about coffee, it just allows you to do stupid things more quickly and with more energy. Wealth just allows someone who's foolish and immoral to do more foolish and immoral things and have more influence over the world in doing that. So Socrates says that wealth is morally indifferent. It's neither good nor bad. At most, it's an opportunity or an advantage. And the wise person uses wealth wisely, and the foolish person, and therefore it's not intrinsically good or bad in itself. And it's strange that we keep lapsing into this error of thinking that these things that are at best a means to an end have some intrinsic value, and forgetting that it's wisdom that gives them their value, or ignorance that makes them truly harmful. And so Socrates therefore concludes, after a much more elaborate argument than I've spelled out there, he concludes, look, he goes through this list of things and he says, all of these things are neither intrinsically good or bad. They only become so by the use that we make of them. And therefore, it's the use we make of them that matters. And therefore, it's wisdom, moral wisdom, knowing how to use wealth and good looks and health, knowing how to use life well is the only truly good thing. And ignorance in that regard is the only truly bad thing. And this is the central doctrine of Stoicism, basically. Long ago, and I noticed, here's a quiz for you. Does anyone know where that is? There's only one good, namely knowledge, and only one evil, namely ignorance. He's an ancient author, and he's attributing this to Socrates. It's either a paraphrase, or maybe it comes from a lost text. Not in any of Plato's writings in that form, or in Xenophon, but Diogenes says this is what Socrates was known for teaching, and certainly it's consistent with what's said about him in the works of Plato and Xenophon. And he doesn't mean knowledge in general. Socrates specifically meant arete, or moral wisdom, is the only true good, and kakia, or vice, moral ignorance, is the only true evil. Okay, so does anyone know where that photo is from? I'll give you a second to reply. No? Cool. I'll tell you. I'll let you out of your misery. It's the Library of Congress. So on the wall of the Library of Congress, they have this quote from Socrates, which expresses the central doctrine of Stoic philosophy. There you go. So the Stoics were also known for this idea that there are 4 cardinal virtues, and Christian authors refer to them as the cardinal virtues: wisdom, justice, courage, and self-discipline. And these are repeated throughout the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. So moral wisdom is the most important virtue, Sophia, applied to our relationships with other people. It's called Dikaiosune. It consists of justice, fairness, and kindness towards other people. And wisdom in relation to fear is the virtue of courage. Wisdom in relation to our desires is the virtue of self-discipline. And so these virtues of self-mastery are required in order for the Stoic sage to live consistently with wisdom and justice. He has to be able to overcome fear and desire in order to do that. And so we have these virtues of courage and self-discipline in Stoicism as well. So those are the famous 4 cardinal virtues of Stoicism. So, okay, we're getting into the guts of Stoic psychology. I'm just going to say one other little kind of theoretical thing about Stoicism, and then we'll get into the practical techniques. So some people mistakenly assume that the Stoics say that we should uproot, extirpate all of the passions, all of the emotions, and that a Stoic would be unemotional. And that's definitely not true. That's a misinterpretation. That's fake news, right? The Stoics didn't say that. Actually, if you read the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius and the other Stoic text, we've already mentioned love. Like, they mention many other healthy emotions, like, throughout their writings. So it's not true that they just wanted to remove them all. In fact, Marcus Aurelius describes the Stoic ideal as being free from irrational or unhealthy passions, and yet full of philostorgia, full of love. So free from these unhealthy passions and yet full of kind of rational love. So the Stoic sage has healthy, rational emotions. So the Stoics they make a distinction between good, bad, and indifferent emotions, right? So the bad emotions are excessive, irrational, and unhealthy. And the Stoics want to not just suppress those, but to replace them with healthy emotions, which they call eupatheiai. So they have a whole system for classifying healthy emotions. And they believe it's really the underlying beliefs that our emotions are based upon that we need to revise. So the Stoics introduced, or they inherited from Socrates, something that we call today the cognitive theory of emotion. And that's really incredibly important. It's the idea our language is geared towards thinking of reason and emotions as being 2 separate things. And the Stoics say that's a big mistake, a profound mistake. And in fact, reason and emotion are two sides of the same coin. And when you understand that, it allows you to gain insight into your emotions and to gain control over them by addressing the underlying beliefs that shape them. And that is the central theoretical premise of all modern cognitive behavioral psychotherapy. So there are large volumes of modern scientific evidence that now substantiate that central premise. And that's one of the reasons that Stoicism has become very popular again, because it's consistent. It gets this indirect support from huge volumes of scientific evidence. But the Stoics also have these different, they call them the propatheiai. And this is very, very important as well. This would be the difference between having a very toxic and unhealthy attitude and being, this is, it's a secret of emotional resilience in a way. So Stoics say, look, in the realm of emotion, there are aspects of your emotion that are under voluntary control, and then there are aspects that aren't. And the aspects that are reflex-like or involuntary, you need to learn to accept with indifference and not try to avoid or suppress and not dwell upon and amplify. You need to learn to kind of just ride them out and accept them. And that's absolutely integral to what we know about modern emotional resilience. The people who come into psychotherapy are very, very often trying too hard to control or avoid involuntary emotions and completely neglecting to do anything about or take responsibility for the voluntary aspect of their emotion. So this is, therapists spend a lot of time getting clients to understand this distinction, and it's central to emotional resilience. Let me just check in with you guys briefly. Cool. Okay. So the single most famous quote from the Stoics comes from passage 5 of the Enchiridion of Epictetus, and it says, it's not things that upset us, but our judgments or our opinions about them. And actually, Epictetus specifically has in mind our value judgments. So it's thinking that things are intrinsically good or bad, and that's the main thing that upsets us, that causes emotional distress. It's not things that upset us, but our opinions about them. And the reason that particular quote has become so famous is that Albert Ellis, in the 1950s, the pioneer of cognitive behavioral therapy, used to teach that quote to all of his students and all of his clients. And he included it in most of his many books about rational emotive behavior therapy, the precursor of CBT. So every CBT practitioner should know that quote, by heart, as it were. It's not things that upset us, but our judgments about them, because it encapsulates the cognitive theory of emotion. This is how I like to explain it. Clients come into therapy, they'll talk about anger, fear, or sadness that's troubling them, and then they'll tell the therapist the story of their problem, and they'll talk about how it's destroying their life, it's damaging their relationships, it's like making life difficult for them at work, all the negative consequences of this emotion that they're struggling with. And then at some point, the client will do something like justify the feeling. They'll say, I know it doesn't make sense, I know it's causing a lot of harm, but it's just the way I feel. So I know this is a crazy, unhealthy emotion. I know it's causing me a lot of problems, but I can't help it. It's just the way I feel. And Ellis used to reply to them by saying, but it's not just the way that you feel, it's also the way that you think. Because thoughts and emotions aren't two completely separate things like apples and oranges. As the Stoics realized, they're actually intertwined. They're two different aspects of the same thing. And someone who's anxious generally, typically, has an underlying cognitive schema, an underlying belief that something catastrophic is going to happen and they won't be able to cope with it. And it's usually anxiety is accompanied by the sense of the belief that it's going to happen imminently. So, generally our emotions are associated with assumptions, beliefs, value judgments. And once we acknowledge that, we can identify what those are, we can put them into words, and we can start asking, what's the evidence for that? Is that rational or irrational? Is that inconsistent with other things that we believe? And that opens up a whole toolbox of cognitive therapy interventions. So that's really the essence of the cognitive revolution in psychotherapy. It changes the whole ballgame of psychotherapy. And Freud didn't know that, Like for half a century, psychotherapists didn't really understand that until the cognitive revolution in the 1960s, but they got the idea from the Stoics. The Stoics were way ahead of the game in many respects. 2,000 years ago, 2,500 years, Zeno understood, and Socrates before him understood, that our emotions are shaped by our underlying beliefs. Albert Ellis said, this principle, which I have inducted from many psychotherapeutic sessions with scores of patients during the last several years, was originally discovered and stated by the ancient Stoic philosophers. Aaron Beck, the founder of cognitive therapy, said, the philosophical origins of cognitive. So Stoicism is the granddaddy of modern evidence-based psychotherapy. It's also the granddaddy of much modern self-help literature, usually based on similar premises. So let's do some practical stuff. Let's look at the practices. So first thing I want to do is a little bit of a side note, just because I think this is very relevant to the pandemic. And I want to give you some nuggets of wisdom, like a list of 4 strategies, 4 cognitive strategies that are actually attributed to Socrates. Man, when I studied Plato at university, when I was a student, and it seems so dry and theoretical. It wasn't until later in life that I realized that if you look closely, even at Plato's Republic, Book 10 of Plato's Republic is where this comes from. Socrates gets very concrete, down-to-earth psychological advice for coping with stress. So I call this the Stoic Socrates. In Plato's Republic, Glaucon, Plato's brother, is talking to Socrates about Greek tragedies. And basically, Socrates says, look, the tragedies are kind of garbage because the heroes in them act like idiots, and they're the authors of their own tragedy in many cases. So terrible, terrible role models. And Glaucon's kind of taken aback by this. And he asks Socrates, basically, can he explain what he's talking about? Because the Greeks loved their tragedies. And Socrates said, look, they're only tragic because the people that are in them are acting like idiots, because they're all about self-inflicted tragedy, if you think about it carefully. And the Stoics really went with this idea as well. They thought that the Greek tragedies were very valuable, but almost like case studies in psychopathology. How to learn, like how not to think, we could learn from them. So here's some practical stuff that Socrates says. He said, look, the wise man or woman in the face of misfortune or adversity, such as the current pandemic, would think about things differently than the characters in these tragedies. And Glaucon says, well, what do you mean, Socrates? What would he do? Or what would she do? And then Socrates describes these 4 cognitive strategies, ways of looking at events that allow the wise to cope with them more resiliently. And it preempts a lot of the things that the Stoics later said because they were influenced by Socrates. So number 1, Socrates says, like, the wise man, whether the events befalling us are good or bad. And there's really 2 reasons for that. One, that as the Greeks knew, there are many reversals of fortune. And if you think about things in terms of the bigger picture, what seems like misfortune often turns out to be good fortune. Not always, but often. It's very often the case that, for example, somebody, think of all the times in life people have a relationship breakup. And it seems like a terrible catastrophe at the time. But years later, they look back on it and they think it was probably for the best. So, it seems terrible at the time, but then maybe you'll go on and meet somebody better for all you know. Even the current pandemic, terrible as it is, this virus has a low fatality rate, whereas diseases like Ebola have a 50% fatality rate. So in a sense, we're fortunate that it wasn't a much more dangerous virus. It was only really a matter of time with all the travel in the modern world, with airplane travel, that a virus spread, that we had a pandemic. And we're lucky that we get to prepare in response to something that's far less. So Socrates says, look, we can't be certain how bad these events are unless we understand the bigger picture. And also, whether something's truly harmful for you depends on the use that you make of it. So many people will be able to take misfortunes and turn them to their advantage. What seems like a misfortune might be an opportunity for growth and learning. It might actually be good for you in the long run, even though it seems like a setback. So this is the number 1 thing. Socrates says the wise tell themselves they cannot be certain that what seems like a misfortune actually is as bad as it appears. And then Glaucon says, what's the second thing? And Socrates says that the wise person in the face of misfortune tells themselves that we gain nothing by grieving excessively. We merely add additional suffering to the existing pain and discomfort that we're experiencing. So Socrates says the wise tell themselves, why would you make yourself suffer even more in addition to the suffering you're already experiencing? So worrying, freaking out, complaining just piles on another whole level of additional suffering, which seems unnecessary. The third is that the wise tell themselves that no human affairs are of absolute importance in the grand scheme of things. They're not worth getting that upset about. And what he's alluding to there is the Stoic idea that, which is confirmed by modern research on the emotions, that when people are upset, they put events under a magnifying glass and focus on them in isolation. But when we look at the bigger picture, so somebody says something that insults you, but they've probably said loads of other things to you over the course of your life that are neutral or complementary. Your feelings tend to be moderated by lots of other information, good, bad, and indifferent. And if you want to get really upset about something, forget about every other mitigating factor and just focus on the negative thing in isolation. That's what people do when they're really depressed or really anxious. We call it threat monitoring and anxiety. And Socrates is saying, look, when you look at the bigger picture, though, when you put everything in context, no individual thing is worth getting that upset about because its significance is balanced out by some of the other things that are going on in the wider context. Whether something really is as much of a misfortune as it appears at first. Number two, you remind yourself, the wise remind themselves that we gain nothing by putting on a whole extra layer of additional suffering unnecessarily. Number three, the wise remind themselves that nothing has absolute significance when it's seen in the grand scheme of things, because there are many other factors going on in life that we need to take account of emotionally. And then Glaucon says, well, what's the fourth thing, Socrates? And Socrates says, well, the fourth is the most important of all. The wise man or woman, the philosopher, in the face of adversity, Aurelius famously had lived through the Antonine Plague. Incidentally, Socrates lived through the Plague of Athens. And so we know he was renowned for having coped very well for a plague that was suffered by the Athenians. Again, also during a war, during the Peloponnesian War. So Socrates says that the philosopher, the lover of wisdom, tells themselves that worrying excessively, getting upset, complaining, grieving excessively, allowing themselves to wallow and indulge in their distress, prevents us from doing precisely the thing that's most required in the face of adversity, such as a pandemic. Glaucon says, what's that, Socrates? And Socrates says, to think clearly and rationally in order to solve the problems that we face. He says the wise tell themselves that allowing themselves to freak out and worry excessively prevents the most important thing from happening. And that's that we think about things calmly and rationally in order to solve problems. So those are four cognitive strategies that Socrates told his students the wise can employ in the face of adversity. And I think all of them are relevant to the current pandemic, and all of them relevant to Stoic philosophy. Cool. Some of you are saying that you have to leave it there, but hopefully we've still got plenty of people and you're getting the stream okay, I think, still, so that's good. So the main technique of Stoicism, people today tend to call the dichotomy of control. So it's summed up in the first sentence of Epictetus's handbook, the Enchiridion. The opening sentence says, some things are up to us and other things are not. And that's a truism. That's just stating the obvious. That's like saying some things are big and other things are small. But it's interesting that it's so psychologically important because we forget it all the time and we blur the distinction between what's up to us and what isn't. And we know that people focusing on this distinction, it allows people to cope better with stress when they focus on this distinction and become clearer about it. You could say that it's the distinction between what we do, our own actions, our own voluntary actions, and everything else. That's the distinction that the Stoics think we need to bear in mind. And it's encapsulated in a famous modern saying popularized by Alcoholics Anonymous called the Serenity Prayer, which says, God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. So the Stoics, on the one hand, want us to be more indifferent, more accepting of things that aren't under our direct control, as just the weather, just the furniture of life, but also to take more ownership, to step up and take more responsibility for the things that are value judgments, our way of thinking, and our beliefs about events. The role that we play in upsetting ourselves, we need to take more responsibility for what we're doing to ourselves. We need to take more responsibility for being the authors of our own tragedies in life, they want to say. So dichotomy of control, in a sense, is the kind of central psychological technique of Stoicism. But the other main technique is the one that I alluded to earlier. This quote, it's not things that upset us, but our judgments about them. This is where, it's kind of hard to explain in a way, but to many people, this seems like a cool idea. It seems like a theory. It's the central premise of cognitive therapy, but it's actually also a cognitive technique. Really grasping this idea and reflecting on it is possibly the most powerful technique, or one of the most powerful techniques in modern psychotherapy. There's been a lot of research on it over the past couple of decades, and we call it cognitive distancing. That's the name that Beck gave to it. The Stoics sometimes call it catharsis, or purification, the separation of our value judgments from external things. So the way that Beck describes this to his clients is it's a way of understanding what's going on in your mind that's very liberating, and it dilutes our emotional responses. It's central to emotional resilience. It's the most important, it's the essence of everything, really. It's the ability to realize that when you're upset about things, the awfulness of a situation doesn't exist in nature. The awfulness of it is a value judgment. It's our response to it. So I say that something is big or small or black or white or awful. And it sounds like these are all qualities that are all equivalent. They're all just descriptions of the external state of affairs. But when I say it's awful, I'm doing something quite different. I'm not describing a physical property of the event. I'm projecting something onto it. I'm shining a light on it. I'm illuminating it from the perspective of awfulness. And so that's why cognitive therapists use this terrible neologism, but it's very helpful. We talk about clients catastrophizing events. So rather than saying the pandemic catastrophizing it, like we're choosing to view it as a catastrophe, that's one perspective. And there's a kind of arbitrariness about it. Nature doesn't view it as a catastrophe. It's just something that it does. It's just nature shuffling around the atoms. Like, nature's indifferent. It doesn't care. Like, we choose to view it as a catastrophe, and realizing that the catastrophic nature of it is something that we're projecting onto it tends to dilute the intensity of our emotional responses. And part of that is realizing that other people might view it differently. So some people might be much more accepting of it, or some people might view it as an opportunity to strengthen their character. Paradoxically, many people with mental health problems say that they feel better during the pandemic, and there are a number of theories about why that might be the case. So some people have paradoxical responses to stress or misfortune. Beck used to tell his clients, think of it this way. Imagine that you're wearing rose-tinted glasses, and it's a fusion or lacking cognitive distance would be as if you said, well, the world is rose-tinted. That's just what it looks like. So you're blending the color of your lenses with reality as if it's a quality of the external world. But suppose someone else comes along and they've got dark blue glasses and they say, no, the world looks blue and gloomy. And then you swap your glasses and you realize it's a lens through which you're looking, whether it's blue or catastrophic, or whether it's cheerful or rose-tinted, like, is a quality that inheres in the glass and the lens through which you're looking, not in the external event itself. And other people might see it quite differently. And really grasping that feeling it, sensing it, remembering it, seeing of flexibility. And that gives us emotional resilience because it means that we have flexibility in our thinking, we're more adaptive, we're less kind of tied into a particular way of looking at things, and our emotions begin to feel as if they're more under our control and less dominating. So it's very important. Beck describes it as a difference between looking through the lenses and maybe taking them off and looking at them. That's when we gain cognitive distancing, or some psychologists, behavioral psychologists, will say we defuse our thoughts from external reality. So the Stoics talk about this idea. It's central to the whole of Stoic psychology. Let me just check in again. Cool. You guys are all following that. So some other techniques that the Stoics do, Marcus Aurelius mentions this morning meditation at the beginning of each day. He talks about the Pythagorean earlier philosophers, pre-Socratic philosophers, meditating on the sunrise and contemplating the broader cosmological perspective, thinking of themselves from this bigger picture perspective at the beginning of the day to get into the right mindset, but also planning the day ahead and thinking about the tasks that you have to face and how dealing with them in accord with wisdom and virtue might be different from being guided by our negative emotions, and thinking of it as a kind of fork in the road and the contrast between following reason and following our pathological emotions or passions, as the Stoics say, contrasting the consequences of following these two different ways of dealing with events. And preparing for setbacks that we might encounter. So one of the most famous passages in the Meditations, Marcus says, say to yourself at the start of each day, I shall meet with meddling, ungrateful, violent, treacherous, envious, and unsociable people. And the Stoics mentally rehearse things that could go wrong and practice dealing with them with equanimity. So they prepare themselves at the beginning of each day. Some people have said to me, how would Stoics develop emotional resilience to cope with the pandemic? And there are things that they would do, as we're seeing. But the main thing that Stoics would do would be to prepare for it in advance. Like someone who practices Stoicism should already, for many years, have been imagining that something like a pandemic could happen so that they can emotionally process, come to terms with their own mortality way in advance. So the secret to resilience building, in part, is preparing for it way in advance. But that also applies to the current situation, because for most people, this, and I hate to break it to you, buddy, is not going to be the worst thing that happens to you in life, because there are going to be probably worse things that happen to you. Apart from anything else, 99.9% of you probably aren't going to die from this virus. Something else is going to get you. So there are other things that you're going to have to deal with that are going to be more morally compromising or challenging for the majority of people. So as catastrophic, actually, it's unlikely to be the biggest challenge that you face in your life. Might be, but probably not. So really, it's a dress rehearsal. And also it's a dress rehearsal for your own mortality, your own death, because it's probably not going to be what actually gets you in the end. So again, resilience building in part is about looking at the bigger picture and preparing for other things that lie ahead of us. And that could be in terms of relationships, poverty, sickness, mortality. The Stoics think we should rehearse all of these things, not worry about them, but practice coming to terms with them, practice facing them like Socrates with wisdom and equanimity. So they call this premeditatio malorum, or the premeditation of bad things, the premeditation of adversity or misfortune. Here's a little illustration from the graphic novel that I'm working on. And then in the evening, the Stoics also borrow this technique from the Pythagoreans. They ask themselves 3 questions. So Pythagoras, in the Golden Verses of Pythagoras, famously says, you shouldn't allow sleep to close your eyes until thrice you've reviewed the events of your day. What have you done well and what have you left undone? So where did you go wrong and act in accord with vice, or where were you guided by emotion rather than reason? What can you learn from that? What did you do well? What should you reinforce and encourage about your behavior? And what did you just omit to do that you could do differently next time? And this creates what I call a learning cycle. So by reviewing events at the end of each day, you can prepare yourself again in the morning to mentally rehearse how to cope with equanimity during the events that lie ahead of you. So every evening, kind of reviewing events, like coaching yourself. Every morning, plan more rationally, more philosophically. Another important technique that the Stoics employ is modeling virtue. I mean, let me just focus on the pandemic. You know, the way I would explain this to you, the Stoics might say, well, how would Socrates cope? How would Marcus Aurelius cope, we might say? They model the attitudes that we can attribute to wise people. And it doesn't even have to be a real person. It could be like a historical figure. It could be somebody you know. But it could also be that you, as a thought experiment, you challenge yourself to imagine someone coping better than you do, hypothetically, even if you can't think of a living example, like coping better with the pandemic. So the way that I usually address this is to say to people, can you imagine someone coping really badly with the pandemic? Are the challenges that are associated with it. And have there been times in the past when you've coped particularly badly, psychologically, emotionally with these things? Do some people cope better or worse than others? Well, it's a truism, of course they do. So then that raises the question, what's the difference? What's the difference? What would be the opposite of coping badly? What would constitute coping well, coping resiliently? Like, how would someone who acts wisely with the current situation, the current adversity, like how would they be thinking about it? So this is the Stoic technique of modeling. We also call it contemplation of the sage. What would Zeno do? What would the ideal sage do? And another important Stoic technique is the contemplation of impermanence or transience, from the philosopher, the pre-Socratic Heraclitus, who said you can't step into the same river twice because there are always new waters are flowing through it. So the Stoics are always reminding themselves of the impermanence of things. If a client, when people worry, it's a curiosity that they focus on a particular period in time. If you think about it, if you're worrying about stuff, how do you decide which segment of time to focus on? Like, you know, how long is the script? Like, when do you cut off? Like, do you go through the whole of your future, or are you just worrying about a particular segment of it? There's an arbitrariness about it. When clients come into therapy, they may say, I'm really upset about the fact that my girlfriend's dumped me. Like, I'm worried about the fact that my powerful technique, incredibly simple technique that therapists use, is to say, well, what's probably going to happen next? And they might say, well, first of all, I'll be really depressed and I'll stay at home and I'll probably cry in my beer and watch Netflix or whatever. And then the therapist will repeat the question, what's probably going to happen next? And they'll say, well, I guess eventually I might try and force myself to go out and socialize again. What's probably going to happen next? Well, I'm probably going to struggle for a while. What's probably going to happen next? Well, I suppose eventually I'll start dating again. What's probably going to happen next? Well, I suppose eventually I'll probably meet someone else. What's probably going to happen next? Well, I guess I'll move on. Like, if you keep moving the marker forward chronologically, it tends to make the catastrophe seem less catastrophic because it requires focusing your attention on problem solving and coping. And it also broadens your perspective so that you see that the negative isn't the only part of the whole picture. The whole story has ups and downs in it, and that tends to moderate and dilute your emotional response. So that's one way of focusing on the impermanence of things. And another central technique for Stoicism, but obviously more challenging, is this idea, existential idea of contemplating and coming to terms with your own mortality, milite thanatou, the rehearsal or preparation of death, we call it in Stoicism. Seneca actually says that every night in bed, he tells himself, I might be going to sleep for the last time. I might not wake up in the morning. And every morning he tells himself, I might be waking up for the last time, to remind himself to contemplate his own mortality. So I'm conscious we're reaching the end of the hour. I just wanted to mention this last major technique of Stoicism, which we call the view from above, or modern scholars call it that. And it's kind of something I've alluded to throughout. But literally, the Stoics might visualize looking on events from very high above, and they try to contemplate the current situation as part of a much bigger picture. And it could be spatially and or chronologically. So thinking of current events as if the Zeus is looking down from Olympus on them, or even bigger from a cosmological perspective in terms of the totality of space and time, the smallness and brevity of the present moment. And that tends to balance our feelings, our emotional responses out. And again, it's the opposite of what we know people do when they're experiencing pathological emotions, when they laser beam their attention in and they're very selective in their thinking. That tends to make people wondering, naturally counteracts that. So for the Stoics, wisdom consists in part in being able to keep reaching out to this broader, more chronologically and spatially complete perspective. That's almost definitive of the wisdom of the Stoic sage. You want to see the last slide again? Well, maybe we can put the slides up to download or flashback if you want. The contemplation of death. Somebody wanted to have another look at that slide. Cool. So I hope that you found that helpful. I didn't leave much time for questions. Maybe like if anybody has any quick questions, I'll go answering them just before we wrap up. I don't think I saw many questions so far. Sounds like you're finding these concepts useful, though. That's good. Sounds a bit like NLP. Yeah. I mean, again, NLP is really a Johnny-come-lately, right? It's developed in the 1970s. So all that NLP was doing was just grabbing a bunch of tech. Many of them are derived ultimately from Stoicism. There were some questions. I can't see any. If you had a question and I've missed it, if you want to type it in and repeat it, I'll answer it quickly. Otherwise, no. Cool. Glad you found it useful. Do I have a critique of Stoicism? Not really. I mean, we tend not to follow the Stoics. Some of the cultural values about gender and slavery are kind of dated, although the Stoics also criticized those cultural norms. And their theology, most people don't really accept today, but although some people are still interested in it. Right, those are the main things. Right. Cool. Okay, well, I'm glad you found that helpful. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming along, and we'll try and make the slides available afterwards.